So if you just take as a rough cut, using exit poll data, how men and women have voted in 2012, it's true women were more likely to support Obama than were men. But what's missing in this cut of the data is this kind of breakdown. If you break it down by different racial groups, Obama did not win a majority of white women. What he did was successfully, so for each of these groups, there's two things to notice in this slide. For each of these groups, women were more likely to vote for Obama than men. But what is really driving this effect of Obama having won a majority of the women's vote are how women of color are voting, as opposed to how white women are voting. That exact same kind of point can be made with respect to youth and electoral voting. So if you look at the youngest age groups, those are the groups that are most likely to have supported Obama, especially as compared to the oldest age groups. If you break down the youngest age group by race, you'll see that Obama does not even win a majority of the young white vote. But in fact, it's youth of color that are driving a lot of it. If you look at independents, again, a lot of the attention given to independents was given in the 2008 election. So this, on the left, is change in Democratic voting between 2008 and 2004. Most groups between 2008 and 2004 wind up voting more Democratic. But the effect of independence is small compared to some of the increases in Democratic voting by race that you see. And then between 2008 and 2012, Obama actually, loses in terms of his levels of support among independent voters. And that's in the broader context of growing diversity of independents. So if you look back 30, 40 years ago, if you talked about independents, you were mainly talking about white voters. Today, it's a much more heterogeneous mix. And then you also have this kind of finding, which is very similar to what I described earlier for women and young voters. So if you just took a cut of independent voters, a majority of them supported Obama, but Obama does not win even a majority of white independents, and most of his support from independents comes from non-white independents. So that's all to emphasize the point that if something is going on, like sea change in terms of electoral alignments, at least the best candidate I see for driving that change is something about racial and ethnic traditions. Okay. How am I doing for time? Okay. I think I'm doing great for time. Okay. So what do I mean by partisan realignment without parties? If there's one thing in political science that you're taught about what you need to know if you wanted to know something about an American voter, that would be what party they identified with. So these two are just two quotes that essentially replicate what you could find in a lot of the political behavior literature about the centrality of party identification. The single question, generally speaking, do you think of yourself as a Democrat, Republican, Independent, or what? And this is sort of a emblematic way of thinking about partisan alignment, democratic alignment among African Americans, where you have an initial period where a group is voting more partisan than their party identification is. But over time, what you have is a very close alignment between the rates at which a group votes for a party's candidate and then self-identifies with that party. So keep that in the back of your mind. And this is what the next couple of slides will show what we see for Latinos and Asian Americans. If you just cut the data as Democrat, Republican, or Independent, for Asian Americans and Latinos, the rates of Democratic identification are very, very close to the rates of partisan voting that I showed earlier in the exit poll data. What's missing from that picture is that when you're asked the basic party identification question for Latinos and Asian Americans, a really, really large proportion of respondents don't know how to answer that question. They reject this as a relevant choice. They either refuse to answer, they say I don't know, they say I don't think in terms of these categories, and so on. So when you take that into account, and then compare partisan voting by party identification, even if you include independents who lean towards one party, for Latinos and Asian Americans, there's still a pretty big gap between how much they vote for one party, how often they vote for one party, and their reluctance to identify with that party label. And that's part of the puzzle that we're kind of inching towards an explanation for today. Okay, so towards an explanation, one of the things to note about this reluctance to self-identify with parties is that there's a mirror to that in terms of vote intention. So this is a pre-election survey. We asked people how they intend to vote. And if you just take the two-way Obama or Romney for our full sample, this looks very close to the exit poll data, very heavily favoring Obama over Romney. But what's missing in that picture is about 39% in a pre-election survey, even weeks before the election, who say, I don't know how I'm going to vote. And so that leads to an interesting question, statistically, about how we go about analyzing that. You might analyze that as sort of a nested or sequential kind of decision, or you might think about that as a simultaneous decision. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through that too much. I chose to analyze it for today's purposes as two separate steps. One, which looked at the question of whether or not somebody's uncertain about how they're going to vote, or actually will tell you whether they're going to vote for one of the two major party candidates. And then a second step, which is the choice between Obama and Romney. One of the more striking results in thinking about the choice this way is this sort of effect. So for Asian Americans who have a strong degree of favorability towards the Democratic Party, the more favorable you are towards the Democratic Party, the clearer that makes the choice for you. So you're much less likely to say, I'm uncertain about how you're going to vote. For Asian Americans who have a very favorable view of the Republican Party, it actually makes them much more uncertain about how they're going to vote. So right after the election, Karthik and I wrote a LA Times op-ed where we posited that one of the things that might be going on with Asian Americans is this mix of push factors and pull factors. Push away from the Republican Party and pull towards the Democratic Party. And this is one kind of evidence about a push away from the Republican Party, that those Asian Americans who have strong and positive feelings towards the Republican Party doesn't make their choice any clearer. In fact, it makes them less likely to express a choice. And then there are other things that you might think of as reducing your certainty about how you're going to vote that actually work out the way you think they might. So if you have a high degree of political efficacy, that lowers your likelihood of being undecided. If you score highly on a political knowledge battery, that reduces your likelihood of saying you're uncertain how you're going to vote, and so on. I'm just giving these as illustrative examples of other things that you can find in our analysis. Then in terms of the choice between Obama and Romney itself, one of the things that we think is going on in terms of partisan voting without parties is, in the absence of strong, well-socialized attachments to a political party, what you're going to look for are other possible things. So one of the things that might guide your choice are strong ideological views in general. And the way you can parse out ideological views, this is in the work of Ansal Beher, Rodden, and Snyder, and other people, is that you could distinguish between policy ideology and moral ideology, but those kinds of views may help guide the way you vote. And the other kind of thing that may help guide your vote, independent of your attachment to a party, is how you feel about a candidate in particular. So I'll show you some evidence related to that. The first thing to say is, if you have favorable or unfavorable views of a party, it's going to have an unsurprising relationship to your likelihood of voting for that party's candidate. So, Asian Americans who are more favorable to the Democratic Party, they're much likelier to say they favor Obama over Romney. Similarly, on this end, Asian Americans who are very favorable to the Republican Party are much less likely to say that they're going to favor Obama over Romney. So that's not surprising. I think what is important to add to that are the next set of slides. So one is, there's sort of a net favorability for a candidate. So what this is a measure of how favorable you are towards the candidate of your party, net of how favorable you are towards the party itself. So somebody that's all the way on the far end here thinks very positively of Obama as a candidate, but really hates the Democratic Party. Similarly here, somebody here is very favorable towards Romney, but hates the Republican Party, and you can flip that in the other direction. And it turns out that that kind of candidate effect is pretty strong also in predicting who's going to support Obama as opposed to Romney. And then we think issues also matter quite a bit. And this is just two examples. One is an index of Asian Americans' attitudes on various different policy areas. Do you think we should spend more, less, or keep our spending about the same in these areas? And the more liberal you are in terms of government spending priorities, the more likely you are to support Obama. The more liberal you are on a series of policy items we have about immigration policy, in particular immigration policy towards undocumented, the more likely you are to support Obama. And the last thing is on the dimension of moral ideology, we find some significant effects, but they're very small. So the main thing is to look at the slope of these effects as compared to some of the other things that we've seen. So this sort of moral ideology, moral suasion has some role to play for Asian American voters, but it's not a very dominant aspect of how they think about their vote. You can look at similar kinds of things, such as attitudes on the issue of abortion or LGBT issues and so on. You get the same kind of effect. So this is all a rehash of what I've said already. So I'll just close with the summaries. Actually, I'll close.